I sold the house my mother left me. Every brick, every faded pencil mark on the kitchen doorframe, every ghost that haunted its halls. You're probably thinking I'm a cold, ungrateful son, the kind who turns a family home into a quick paycheck just days after the funeral. I don't blame you. That's the man my mother always told everyone I was. The disappointment. But you don't know the whole story. You don't know what I found in her old mahogany desk, locked away in a small, worn leather ledger that still smelled faintly of her rose garden. My brother, Michael, the golden child who could do no wrong, was left with absolutely nothing. He thought he had won, that he had gotten away with it all. He didn't know our mother's final move wasn't an act of love for me, but a final, desperate act of justice against him. This isn't just a story about an inheritance, it's about a debt being paid in full. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions on this story in the comments. What you're about to hear is the truth she couldn't say while she was alive. For the past 10 years, my life had a rhythm, a quiet and predictable beat that I had built for myself. I lived in a small second-floor apartment above a bakery in a town 3 counties away from Elm Street. My mornings didn't start with the scent of my mother's roses, but with the warm, yeasty smell of baking bread wafting up through the floorboards. It was a simple, honest smell. It promised a new day, with no expectations attached. My world was my workshop, a rented garage space a few blocks from my apartment. It was a place filled with a clean, sharp scent of sawdust and wood varnish, a universe away from the polished silence and lingering perfume of my mother's house. I am a furniture restorer. I take what is old and broken, what others have discarded, and I find the strength still hidden in the grain. I give it a new life. It's methodical, patient work. It requires you to strip away the damaged layers to find the solid core underneath. In a way, it's what I had tried to do with my own life. In the corner of that workshop, under a canvas dropcloth, sat my most important project, my grandfather's old rocking chair. It was the one thing I took with me when I left home all those years ago. It was made of solid oak, darkened by age, with a gentle curve to the back that seemed to remember the shape of every person who had ever sat in it. The right arm was cracked, a casualty of one of Michael's childhood tantrums, and the seat's caning had long since given way. For years, I hadn't touched it. It felt like a piece of a life I wasn't allowed to claim. But about a year before my mother passed, I finally pulled off the dusty cloth. I started the slow process of sanding down the old chipped varnish, my hands moving carefully over the wood, feeling the history and its imperfections. The rhythmic scrape of the sandpaper was a kind of meditation, a way of connecting with the one man in my family who had always looked at me and seen potential, not a problem to be solved. I remembered him sitting in that chair on the sun porch of the Elm Street house, the afternoon light filtering through the overgrown ivy, dust motes dancing in the golden shafts. He'd have a glass of iced tea sweating on the small table beside him, and I'd be on the floor with my model airplanes. He'd tell me stories about his time as an engineer, explaining how trusses and beams worked, how to build something that would last. My mother would sometimes appear in the doorway, a faint line of disapproval on her face, before calling Michael to come practice his piano. Michael, who had no interest in building things, only in having them. He would plink out a few discordant notes from the living room, while my grandfather and I quietly planned how to build a birdhouse. That chair wasn't just wood and glue. It was a memory of a time when I felt like I belonged somewhere. My contact with my family had dwindled to a carefully managed trickle. A birthday card from my mother every year, with a crisp $20 bill and a generic, pre-written sentiment. Never a handwritten note. Phone calls were rare, and when they happened, they were brief and sterile. She would ask if I was managing, a word that dripped with the assumption that I was perpetually on the verge of failure. She would then spend 10 minutes detailing Michael's latest achievements. A promotion at his new tech firm, a fancy business trip to Zurich, the down payment on his luxury condo. I learned to just listen, to make non-committal sounds of encouragement. It was easier than trying to explain the quiet satisfaction I found in the grain of a freshly planed piece of maple, or the pride in delivering a restored antique to a grateful client. To her, my life was a small, dusty footnote in the grand story of Michael's success. The truth is, I had accepted it. I had built a wall around that part of my heart, and my life was peaceful, if a little lonely. I remember one specific afternoon, years ago, when I was about 12. I had spent a month building a detailed replica of a B-17 bomber, a complex model with dozens of tiny, delicate pieces. I had just finished painting the final insignia on the wing when Michael came storming into my room, furious that our father had praised my patience. He grabbed the plane from my desk before I could stop him and, in a fit of pique, threw it against the wall. It shattered into 100 pieces. I didn't cry or yell. I just looked at the wreckage on the floor, then at him. He didn't even apologize. He just sneered and said, "It was just a stupid toy anyway." That night, I stayed up with a bottle of model glue and tweezers, painstakingly putting it back together. It was never perfect again. The cracks were always visible if you looked closely. But it flew. I made it fly. That was Michael. He was a breaker of things. And I was the one who was left to pick up the pieces. My life before that fateful day in October was built on this foundation of distance. It was a quiet existence, defined by the work of my hands and the small circle of clients and acquaintances who knew me as Leo, the quiet guy who could fix anything made of wood. I would finish my day at the workshop, walk home as the sun set, and cook a simple meal in my small kitchen. Sometimes I'd sit by the window, look out at the city lights, and feel a strange sense of contentment. I had survived. I had built a life, however small, that was entirely my own, free from the crushing weight of my mother's judgment and my brother's shadow. I didn't know it then, but that quiet, orderly world was the deep, calm breath before the plunge. The storm had been gathering for years on Elm Street, and it was about to break right over my head. The morning after the funeral, the house felt hollowed out, like a chest after a deep, final sigh. The air was thick, with the cloying scent of wilting lilies and stale coffee. I was in the study before dawn, sitting in the worn leather chair behind the mahogany desk. I didn't open the drawer. I didn't need to. The weight of that small leather ledger felt permanently fused to my memory, every line item a scar. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with an unnerving loudness, counting down the seconds in a new, uncertain era. I just sat there, my fingers tracing the faint scratches on the desk's surface, and I waited. I knew he wouldn't be able to stay away. The creak of the third step on the staircase announced Michael's arrival. He descended like a king surveying a newly conquered, albeit shabby, territory. He was dressed in a cashmere sweater and designer jeans that seemed to absorb all the light in the dim hallway. He didn't ask how I slept. He didn't mention our mother. He gestured vaguely at the living room and said, "First thing to go will be that wallpaper. It's hideous." He walked into the kitchen and I heard him opening and closing cabinets, a series of sharp, impatient sounds. He came back with a mug of coffee, leaning against the doorframe of the study, looking at me as if I were a piece of old furniture he hadn't yet decided what to do with. "You know," he began, taking a slow sip, "I've been thinking. This place is a lot for one person to handle, especially for someone like you." He let the words hang in the air. Someone like me. He didn't have to say it. The man with sawdust under his fingernails, the one who lived in a small apartment above a bakery. The failure. I didn't rise to the bait. I just looked at him, my hands resting flat on the desk. My silence seemed to unnerve him. He was used to me either retreating or lashing out. This quiet stillness was a language he didn't understand. He pushed off the doorframe and walked further into the room, his expensive leather shoes silent on the old Persian rug. "Look, Leo, I'm trying to be the bigger person here. I was the one who was here for her, day in and day out, for the last 5 years. I handled everything. The funeral alone was over $15,000. It's all been a tremendous expense." He paused, expecting a reaction, an apology, maybe an offer to help pay. I gave him nothing. My mind flashed to the ledger, to the entry from March 12th, 2 years prior. $75,000 transferred to M-Tech Holdings. Another from the year before. $50,000 investment capital. $15,000 was a rounding error in the fortune he had already stolen. "So here's what I'm proposing," he continued, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous generosity. "We sell the house. Quickly. I have a contact, a developer who will give us a fair price. Probably around $450,000. Cash offer, no inspections. We split it. 50-50. You walk away with a nice little nest egg, more money than you've ever seen in your life, and I can finally put this all behind me. He smiled, a tight, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. He saw it as a brilliant move, a way to get his hands on the only asset left, all while painting himself as the gracious, forgiving brother. I thought about the rocking chair in my workshop, the one my grandfather gave me. I thought about the solid oak, the way it had held its shape for decades, its strength hidden beneath a cracked and peeling surface. My mother had tried to throw it out once, calling it junk. Michael had laughed. They only ever saw the surface of things. They never bothered to look for the solid core underneath. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle in my chest. He wasn't just greedy. He had no respect for our mother, for this house, for anything but the number at the bottom of a balance sheet. I finally spoke. My voice was even, quiet. I'm not selling the house, Michael. His smile vanished. A flicker of disbelief. Then irritation crossed his face. What do you mean you're not selling? Don't be difficult, Leo. What are you going to do with it? You can't afford the property taxes, let alone the upkeep. This isn't your world. He took a step closer, his voice lowering into a familiar, condescending tone he'd used since we were children. This is a business decision. You need to take the emotion out of it. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. I looked him directly in the eye. The emotion was taken out of it a long time ago. I said, "This is my house now. You should probably finish your coffee and go." Michael's face contorted, disbelief warring with a deep, familiar contempt. For a moment he looked genuinely stunned, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken back to him. Then, a short, ugly laugh escaped his lips. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place, of a final door slamming shut. "Go?" he repeated, shaking his head as if pitying my ignorance. "Oh, Leo, you still don't get it, do you? You wander back in here after a decade of silence, find a piece of paper, and think you're king of the castle. This isn't your world. You just get to visit it for a little while." He set his coffee mug down on the polished surface of the desk, leaving a damp ring, an act of casual disrespect that was so perfectly him. He began to pace, a predator in a cage of his own making. "Let me explain how this is going to work, since you seem to be a little slow. For 5 years, I was the one here. 5 years. Do you have any idea what that's like? It wasn't just dropping by for Sunday dinner. It was managing her investments, paying her bills, dealing with the doctors when she started getting confused. It was listening to her endless stories about the good old days, about Dad, about her precious roses. It was a full-time job, Leo. A job with no pay, no vacation, and an increasingly difficult boss." He stopped and pointed a finger at me, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "While you were off playing with your little wooden toys, I was here, earning this house. Every single rotten floorboard of it." I remained silent, my hands resting on the back of the leather desk chair. The worn leather felt cool and smooth under my palms. I could feel the faint vibration of the grandfather clock ticking through the floorboards, a steady, indifferent heartbeat. Michael took my silence as weakness, as an invitation to press his advantage. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk, invading the space our mother had commanded for so long. "So here's the real deal," he said, his voice now slick with counterfeit reason. "Forget the 50-50 split. That was me being generous. That was me trying to give my screw-up brother a handout. The will is a mistake, a product of a failing mind, and any judge will see that. But I'm willing to avoid the courts, to keep this in the family." He paused for dramatic effect. "I've run the numbers. 5 years, 60 months. At a conservative rate of $2, $500 a month for live-in care and financial management. A bargain, by the way. That comes to $150,000. Add in the funeral expenses. Another $15,000. So you're going to sign the house over to me. In return, I won't sue you for the $165,000 you technically owe me for services rendered. You walk away with nothing, which is exactly what you deserve. But you also walk away free and clear. It's a clean break." He smiled that same empty, polished smile from before, as if he had just offered me the deal of a lifetime. He believed every word he was saying. He had constructed a reality where his theft was a salary, where his presence was a service worth a six-figure price tag. I looked past him, through the tall window of the study, to the garden outside. The roses were overgrown now, their blooms heavy and drooping after the rain. My mother had loved those roses. Michael saw them as a chore. I thought of the ledger, of the hundreds of thousands of dollars that had vanished. $165,000 was an insult to the scale of his greed. And then he delivered the final killing blow, the one that severed the last frayed thread of brotherhood between us. "You know," he said with a sigh, straightening up, "the last year, she was terrified of being alone. She would call me in the middle of the night, crying, saying she heard noises. It was pathetic. But she knew who held the power. She knew who was writing the checks. She did what I told her. You think she left you this house out of love? She did it to spite me. That's all you ever were to her, Leo. A tool to be used. A final pathetic little jab from the grave." That was it. That was the moment. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The ticking of the clock grew louder. The faint scent of old paper and lemon polish filled my lungs. He hadn't just disrespected her memory. He had confessed to his own emotional tyranny, painting her fear and dependence as a victory. He saw her love not as a gift but as leverage. A cold, quiet calm washed over me, a clarity so sharp it felt like a physical thing. The fog of grief, of confusion, of old hurts, it all just burned away. I wasn't the disappointed son anymore. I wasn't the failed brother. I was the executor of a will. I was the owner of a property. And I was the keeper of a truth, written in a small leather ledger. I let go of the chair and looked him straight in the eye. My voice, when it came out, was devoid of any emotion at all. It was flat, hard, and final. "You have 30 days to remove your personal belongings from this property, Michael. I suggest you start now." Michael stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The shock on his face was genuine, a rare crack in his polished facade. It lasted for only a second before morphing into a sneer. 30 days? He scoffed, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You're delusional. I'll have my lawyer on the phone by noon. We'll see how long your little fantasy lasts when you're served with a notice to contest the will. You'll be buried in legal fees before the month is out." He grabbed his mug from the desk, turned, and strode out of the study without another word. A moment later, the front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty house, rattling a photograph on the mantelpiece. And then, there was only silence, broken by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I stood there for a long time, listening to that clock. It was the same sound that had marked the passing of my childhood, the same sound that had measured out the final hours of my mother's life. But it sounded different now. It wasn't counting down to an end. It was counting up to a beginning. The hot, blinding anger I had felt earlier was gone. In its place was a profound, almost chilling calm. It felt like the moment in my workshop after I've stripped a piece of furniture down to its bare wood. The chaos of the old chipped varnish is gone, and all that's left is the clean, honest grain, waiting for a steady hand. My brother thought this was about a house. He thought it was about money and lawyers and emotional leverage. He was wrong. This was about restoration. I walked over to the mahogany desk and ran my hand over the damp ring his coffee mug had left, a small, careless stain on a lifetime of careful preservation. With a cloth from the drawer, I methodically polished the surface until the mark was gone. I sat down in her chair, the leather sighing under my weight, and pulled the small ledger toward me. I opened it to the first entry detailing a transfer to one of Michael's shell companies, August 2nd, 5 years ago. $40,000. Labeled simply as M. Project. I thought about the rocking chair in my shop, its cracked arm and broken seat. I knew that restoring it would take weeks of patient work, carefully separating the joints, gluing and clamping the split wood, painstakingly reweaving the cane seat, strand by strand. There would be no quick fix. You can't rush integrity back into something that's broken. You have to rebuild it from its foundation. That's what I would do now. I wasn't going to fight Michael on his terms, with loud arguments and messy family drama. That was his world, a world of surfaces and loud pronouncements. I was going to beat him in mine, a world of details, of evidence, of patient, methodical work. I pulled out my phone, its screen bright in the dim study. I didn't search for a family lawyer. My finger tapped out a different search. Forensic accountants specializing in elder financial exploitation. A list of firms appeared. One name stood out, an office located just 40 minutes away in the city. Harrison Forensic Advisory. Their website was simple, professional. It spoke of tracing assets, uncovering hidden transactions, and providing expert testimony. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:22 a.m. I pressed the call button. Michael thought he had slammed the door on this chapter of our lives. He had no idea I was about to quietly, meticulously take his entire world apart, piece by piece. The voice on the other end of the line was crisp and professional. Harrison Forensic Advisory, this is David Harrison speaking. I explained my situation in as few words as possible, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet study. I mentioned a contested inheritance and financial discrepancies. I didn't use the word stole. I didn't have to. Mr. Harrison simply said, "Can you be at my office at 2 p.m.? Bring everything you have." The call lasted less than 3 minutes. I hung up and looked at the ledger on the desk. Everything I had. It felt both impossibly heavy and deceptively light. I spent the next few hours making copies of every single page. The hum of the old scanner, a new, purposeful sound in the house's deep silence. Harrison's office was on the 12th floor of a glass and steel building downtown, a world of silent elevators and hushed, neutral-toned carpets. It smelled of brewed coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. Nothing like the scent of old paper and roses I had just left behind. David Harrison was a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a reassuringly calm demeanor. He didn't offer condolences or ask about my family. He gestured to a chair, poured me a glass of water, and said, "Show me what you've got." I pushed the stack of copies across his wide, uncluttered desk. For nearly an hour, the only sound was the rustle of paper as he turned each page. He would occasionally make a note on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving with quiet efficiency. He didn't look up, didn't react. He just absorbed the data, his face a mask of professional concentration. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the desk. "Mr. Collins," he began, his voice even, "what I'm seeing here is a clear pattern of systematic fund transfers from your mother's personal accounts to a series of LLCs. These entities, MTech Holdings, Apex Innovations, Northstar Ventures, they all trace back to a single director, your brother, Michael Collins." He paused, letting the words settle. "The total amount I can see from this ledger alone is approximately $870,000 over a period of 58 months. The transfers are often disguised as investment capital, management fees, or project loans, none of which appear to have any corresponding return on investment documented here." Hearing the number spoken aloud gave it a terrifying weight. It wasn't just ink on a page anymore. It was a house, a retirement, a life's work, gone. "My brother claims I owe him $165,000 for caregiving and expenses," I said, the words tasting like ash. A faint, dry smile touched Harrison's lips. A classic preemptive strike. He's attempting to frame his exploitation as a service. It's common. And it won't hold up to scrutiny. He leaned forward again. "My firm can conduct a full forensic audit. We will trace every dollar. We'll subpoena bank records, brokerage statements, and corporate filings. We build a complete, undeniable financial narrative. My retainer is $10,000. My hourly rate is $450. It's not inexpensive, but if what this ledger indicates is accurate, we will recover far more than our fee." I didn't hesitate. I wrote him a check from the small inheritance my grandfather had left me years ago, an account I had barely touched. It felt like I was finally using the money for its intended purpose, to protect the family my grandfather had tried to build. Before I left, Harrison gave me a business card. "You'll also need a lawyer, not a family lawyer, a litigator. His name is Alistair Finch. He's the best at this kind of thing. Tell him I sent you. He'll understand the situation immediately." I left Harrison's office and walked out into the bright, cold afternoon. The city felt different. It was no longer a place I was hiding in, but a place with resources, with tools I could use. The first two pieces of my plan were in place. That evening, I drove my truck to my old workshop. Under the dusty canvas, the oak rocking chair sat waiting. It was only partially restored. Its surface is a patchwork of old varnish and newly sanded wood. I loaded it carefully into the back of my truck. An hour later, I was placing it on the sun porch of the Elm Street house, in the exact spot where my grandfather used to sit. The house was mine now. It was time to start bringing my life into it, not just my mother's past. The next 10 days were a blur of quiet activity. I met with Alistair Finch, a sharp, no-nonsense man who reviewed my case and agreed to take it on contingency, taking his fee from the final settlement. He filed the initial paperwork with the probate court, officially establishing me as the executor and putting a temporary freeze on any attempts to challenge the will. I spent my days in the house, methodically sorting through a lifetime of possessions. I wasn't just cleaning, I was taking inventory. Each object was a memory, a piece of a puzzle I was now seeing in a new light. I found photo albums filled with pictures of Michael's smiling face, his arm always draped possessively around our mother. When I appeared at all, was usually in the background, slightly out of focus. On the morning of the 11th day, a certified letter arrived. It was from a high-priced law firm downtown. I opened it with steady hands. It was a formal notice of intent to contest will and claim for restitution, exactly as Michael had threatened. It was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. Michael was demanding the house be sold to cover the fabricated $165,000 debt he claimed our mother owed him. He was officially declaring war. The letter stated I had 21 days to respond. I read it twice, then placed it neatly on the mahogany desk, right next to the leather ledger. I looked out the window at the rocking chair on the porch. The afternoon sun caught the grain of the sanded oak, revealing the strength that had been there all along. Michael had sent his letter. He thought it was an attack. He didn't realize it was an invitation. He had just given me a legal arena to present my evidence, and a deadline. He had opened the door, and I was more than ready to walk through it. The 21-day deadline wasn't a threat. It was a gift. It was a starting pistol for a race Michael didn't even know he was running. His letter sat on the desk, a crisp white monument to his arrogance, while I began my work. The house, which had felt so hollow and vast, became my headquarters. I turned the small sunroom, the one with the view of the overgrown rose garden, into a command center. I brought in a folding table and set up the scanner. For 3 days, I did nothing but digitize every document I could find in my mother's mahogany desk. 10 years of bank statements, old tax returns from 2008 to the present, brokerage account summaries, credit card bills, and a thick file of receipts she had kept meticulously for everything from garden soil to prescription refills. The musty smell of decades-old paper filled the air, the scent of a life being deconstructed. I uploaded everything to a secure online folder and sent the link to David Harrison. The first report from Harrison's office arrived via encrypted email exactly 7 days later, on October 26th. It was a 12-page preliminary analysis. I printed it out, the pages warm from the laser printer, and read it sitting in my grandfather's rocking chair on the porch. The rocking chair was still a work in progress. I had spent the evenings carefully sanding the arms, the rhythmic back-and-forth motion a counterpoint to the chaotic unspooling of my family's finances. Harrison's report was cold, clinical, and devastating. He had already traced the initial $870,000 from the ledger, but with the bank statements he had found more. Much more. There was a pattern of smaller, almost invisible transfers. $5,000 here labeled consulting fee, $7, $200 there for market research. A recurring monthly payment of $2, $800 to a property management company that, after a quick corporate search, was revealed to be a holding company registered to Michael's home address. He wasn't just taking large sums. He was siphoning her lifeblood, month by month, under the guise of managing her affairs. The new total, Harrison estimated, was closer to $1.1 million. While Harrison followed the money, I followed the life. Michael's claim of providing full-time care was the foundation of his legal threat, and I intended to dismantle it, brick by brick. I started with the neighbors. I baked a loaf of banana bread, a simple, disarming gesture, and walked next door to Mrs. Gable's house. She was a kind, bird-like woman in her 80s who had lived on Elm Street longer than we had. We sat in her tidy living room, which smelled of lavender and Earl Grey tea. I didn't ask about Michael directly. I just asked about my mother. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed, her teacup rattling softly in its saucer. She was so lonely, dear, especially these last 2 years. She'd call me sometimes, just to hear a voice. She said Michael was always so busy with his important business. He'd stop by on Sundays sometimes, for an hour. He'd usually be on his phone the whole time, pacing in the driveway. An hour a week. That was his full-time job. I visited 3 other neighbors. The stories were all the same. Michael was a phantom, a fleeting presence. The real caregivers were the grocery delivery boy and the lawn service crew. Back in the house, I went through my mother's calendars. On the wall in the kitchen, her neat looping script filled the small boxes. Doctor's appointments, garden club meetings, birthdays. But in the last year, the entries became sparse. And I started noticing something else. Little notes in the margins. Next to a canceled dentist appointment from May 14th, M couldn't drive me. Next to a note for her friend Susan's birthday on June 3rd. Call S. No way to get a gift. He wasn't just absent. His absence had consequences. He had isolated her, cutting her off from her own life under the pretense of managing it. He was building a prison and calling it care. The house itself told a story of neglect. A leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom had left a dark, spreading stain on the ceiling below. The furnace filter hadn't been changed in what looked like years. These weren't the signs of a home under the diligent management of a loving son. They were signs of a cash cow being milked dry, with no thought given to its well-being. On day 15 of my 21-day window, I had 2 crucial appointments. The first was with a certified property appraiser named Mr. Jennings, a man Alistair Finch had recommended. He spent 2 hours walking through the house, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. He tapped on walls, measured rooms, and took dozens of photos, his face unreadable. He spent a long time in the garden, noting the mature oak trees and the stone patio. Michael's developer friend had offered $450,000, a quick cash sale. Mr. Jennings delivered his official appraisal 2 days later. The fair market value of the property at 12 Elm Street, accounting for its condition and location, was $725,000. Michael hadn't just lowballed the offer. He was trying to steal another $275,000 right out from under me. My second appointment that day was back at Alistair Finch's office. The conference room was stark and modern, a sharp contrast to the house I was fighting for. Harrison joined us via video call, his face on a large screen on the wall. The 3 of us went over the evidence. The financial trail was now an ironclad chain, linking every dollar from my mother's accounts directly to Michael's pockets. The neighbor testimonies, my mother's calendars, and the home appraisal painted a damning picture of neglect and predatory intent. Alistair listened, nodding slowly, a file open in front of him. When I finished, he looked at me, his expression serious. Leo, we have more than enough to defend against his claim. But defending isn't what we're going to do. The estate has been the victim of a significant financial crime. We're not going to respond to his letter. We are going to file our own petition. He explained the strategy. We would file a petition for surcharge and disgorgement with the probate court. It was a legal action demanding that Michael not only be held liable for the money he took, but that he be forced to return, or, quote, disgorge, every cent to the estate. Including profits he may have made from investing her money, we would be seeking the full $1.1 million, plus interest, plus punitive damages. It was no longer a defense of a will, it was an assault. This will force a full accounting, Alistair said. He will be compelled by the court to produce every financial record he has for the last 5 years. He's expecting a family squabble. We're going to give him a corporate audit. On November 5th, the 20th day since I had received Michael's letter, I drove downtown and met Alistair at the county courthouse. It was a gray, overcast day, the kind that makes the world feel serious and solemn. I stood in the cavernous marble hall while Alistair filed the petition. It was a document nearly 2 inches thick, case number 2023, PBO 1472. It contained Harrison's full report, summaries of the witness statements, and the official property appraisal. The metallic click of the clerk's date stamp on the papers was the loudest sound in the world. It felt final. It felt like a declaration. I had spent the last 3 weeks in the quiet, dusty past. Now I had just pushed the first, heavy domino. As we walked out onto the courthouse steps, a light drizzle began to fall. I looked up at the stone facade of the building. Michael had given me 21 days to surrender. Tomorrow, on the final day, a process server would be walking up his manicured driveway to hand him a document that would inform him he was being sued by his own mother's estate for over $1 million. The war he had started was about to arrive on his doorstep. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. It took less than 24 hours for the storm to break. I was on the sun porch, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. The air smelled of damp earth, and the first hints of autumn decay from the garden. In my hands was a length of cane, soaking in a basin of warm water, preparing it for the intricate process of reweaving the seat of my grandfather's rocking chair. My fingers worked methodically, testing the pliability of the strands. It was quiet, focused work, the kind of work that had saved me for years. The scraping sound of my sandpaper against the oak arm was the only sound, a steady, rhythmic whisper of progress. Then a different sound shattered the peace, the angry screech of tires turning too fast into the gravel driveway. I didn't need to look up. I knew the sound of that German engine, the impatient roar that always announced Michael's arrival. A car door slammed with enough force to startle a flock of birds from the old oak tree. Heavy, furious footsteps pounded up the stone walkway. I placed my sandpaper down on the small side table and picked up a clean, dry cloth, wiping my hands slowly. I didn't get up. I just sat there, in the half-finished chair, and waited. The pounding on the front door wasn't a knock. It was an assault. A series of 3 heavy thuds that vibrated through the house's old bones. I remained still. After a moment of silence, I heard the jiggle of a key in the lock, a key he no longer had the right to use. The door flew open and slammed against the interior wall, the impact shuddering through the floorboards. Michael stood in the hallway, framed by the dim light, his face a mask of mottled rage. He was still in his work clothes, an expensive suit, but his tie was loosened and his hair was disheveled. In his right hand he clutched a thick sheaf of papers, shaking them as if they were a weapon. "What the hell is this, Leo?" he roared, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged foyer. He strode onto the porch, the legal documents held out in front of him. "Petition for surcharge and disgorgement? Are you insane? $1.1 million? He laughed, a high, incredulous sound that held no humor. "Where did you even come up with a number like that? Did you just pull it out of thin air?" I looked from his face down to the papers in his hand, then back up to meet his eyes. My voice was quiet, level. "It's all in the report from the forensic accountant. Exhibit C. I believe it's on page 37. His eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock cutting through the anger. He had assumed this was a bluff, an emotional outburst from his weak little brother. The mention of a forensic accountant, of exhibits and page numbers, introduced a language of cold, hard fact he wasn't prepared for. He quickly recovered, his features hardening again. "This is a joke. A pathetic shakedown. You hired some ambulance chaser to cook up a fantasy. This will never hold up in court. Never." I picked up a fresh strand of cane from the water, running it between my thumb and forefinger to feel its texture. "Alistair Finch isn't an ambulance chaser, Michael. And David Harrison doesn't cook up fantasies. They are both very respected in their fields. You can look them up." The casual, almost helpful tone of my voice seemed to infuriate him more than any shouting could have. He took a step closer, leaning over me, his shadow falling across the rocking chair. "I was her son. I was the one here. That money was for my time, for the sacrifices I made. It was an investment in my business, an investment she wanted to make." His voice was rising, becoming shrill. He was making his case to me, as if I were a judge he could bully. "Then you'll have no problem producing the investment agreements and the records of her returns," I said calmly, not looking up from the cane strand in my hand. "The court will be very interested to see them." A vein pulsed in his temple. He was losing control, the carefully constructed facade of the successful businessman crumbling to reveal the spoiled, panicked child underneath. "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You're dragging our mother's name, our family's name, through the mud. For what? For a house you can't even afford? I'm going to countersue you for defamation, for emotional distress. I will ruin you, Leo. I will take this house and everything else. You will walk away with nothing but lawyer's bills. He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to break, to yell, to show some sign that his threats had landed. I finally looked up from my work, my gaze steady. I looked at the man who had shattered my model airplane all those years ago, the man who had stolen our mother's security, the man who was now threatening to destroy me for daring to hold him accountable. And I felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just a profound, quiet certainty. You should talk to your lawyer, Michael, I said, my voice flat. This conversation is over. I turned my attention back to the rocking chair, picking up my sandpaper and making a long, slow pass over the curve of the arm. The soft, scraping sound filled the sudden, tense silence. It was a sound of restoration, of something being made whole again. It was the sound of me taking back control. Michael stood frozen for a moment longer, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. He had come here for a fight, for a screaming match he knew he could win. He had found a closed door instead. With a wordless cry of pure frustration, he spun around and stormed out of the house, leaving the front door wide open behind him. I heard his car start, the engine revving violently before peeling out of the driveway, spitting gravel against the side of the house. I listened until the sound faded completely, and then there was only the peaceful sound of the sandpaper on the wood. The deposition was scheduled for December 5th, a Tuesday. The room was on the 27th floor of a downtown skyscraper, a sterile, anonymous space designed for conflict. It smelled of nothing at all. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the flat, gray light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Water pitchers sweated onto coasters. I sat on one side with Alistair Finch. Across from us sat Michael and his lawyer, a man named Davies with a forced smile and anxious eyes. A court-appointed mediator, a woman named Ms. Albright, sat at the head of the table, her face a carefully neutral mask. Michael tried to project an air of bored confidence, leaning back in his chair and checking his watch, but the muscle twitching in his jaw gave him away. He wouldn't look at me. I, on the other hand, looked only at him. I had spent the last month finishing my grandfather's rocking chair. The caning on the seat was perfect, a tight, flawless weave. My hands, which had done that patient work, now rested calmly on the table in front of me. Davies cleared his throat and began, his voice a little too loud for the room. He launched into a prepared speech about Michael's selfless dedication, the 5 years of sacrifice, the emotional toll of caring for an ailing parent. He painted Michael as a saint, a martyr who had put his own life on hold. He presented their claim for the $165,000 and full ownership of the house as a matter of simple, moral justice. I listened without expression as he characterized me as an absentee son swooping in at the last minute to claim a prize I hadn't earned. When he finally finished, the room was quiet. Alistair Finch didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of water, then placed a single, thin file on the table. He slid it across the polished surface toward the mediator. "We're not here to discuss my client's relationship with his mother," Finch said, his voice calm and precise. "We're here to discuss the disposition of her assets, specifically the $1,142,871.34 that was systematically transferred from her accounts into entities owned and controlled by Mr. Michael Collins," Davies scoffed. "Alleged transfers. My client was managing his mother's portfolio. These were investments, all of which she approved." Michael nodded in agreement, a smug look on his face. This was the story he had practiced, the lie he had told himself so many times he now believed it. Alistair opened his own file and took out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table to Michael. "Is this one of those investments?" he asked. I could see the document from where I sat. It was a bank wire confirmation. Date, April 17th of the previous year. Amount, $98,500. Payee, Stuttgart Automotive Imports. Michael's face went pale. It was a deathly chalky white. I knew from Harrison's report that this was the exact amount he had paid for his new Porsche 911, a car he'd told the family was a company bonus. That was a loan, Michael stammered, looking at his lawyer for help. She wanted to help me with a down payment on a vehicle. It was a gift. Alistair took out a second sheet of paper. A gift? He repeated softly. That's interesting, because this is a page from your mother's calendar. The entry for April 19th, 2 days after you received your gift, reads, "Furnace broken again. M says no money to fix. Called repairman for estimate. $3. 200. She spent the rest of that winter with 2 space heaters in the living room, Michael." The air went out of the room. Michael's lawyer, Davies, stared at the documents, his professional smile gone, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He was realizing, right there, that his client hadn't just been managing funds. He had been buying luxury sports cars while his mother shivered in her own home. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked cornered, his eyes darting between the papers on the table and his lawyer's stricken face. He finally turned his gaze on me, and for the first time, I saw not anger but pure, undiluted fear. Alistair wasn't finished. He placed a third, much thicker document on the table. "And then there's the matter of tax liability," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "We have your tax returns for the past 5 years, Michael. None of this income, these gifts, these loans, these management fees, was ever declared. Over $1 million of unreported income. The IRS tends to take an interest in cases like this. They call it tax evasion. It carries a penalty of up to 5 years in federal prison. That was it. That was the final, killing blow. Prison." The word hung in the silent, air-conditioned room like a guillotine. Michael slumped in his chair, all the fight draining out of him in a single visible rush. He looked smaller, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. He looked like the 12-year-old boy who had just shattered my model airplane, finally caught, with nowhere left to run. His lawyer put a hand on his arm and leaned in, whispering furiously. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what they were. "It's over. Take the deal." I finally spoke, for the first time in over an hour. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense whispers. "Do you remember what Grandfather used to say, Michael?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide and blank with shock. "He used to say, you can build a house with 1,000 lies, but it only takes one truth to bring it all down." I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. The meeting was over. The power had shifted, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of paper. Alistair laid out the settlement terms. Repayment of the full amount to the estate, all claims to the house and will dropped immediately. In return, the estate would not forward its findings to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Michael didn't even look at the papers. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the polished table, staring at a reflection of a man he no longer recognized. I turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving him there with the ruins of the house he had built. The first check from Michael's settlement arrived by courier 3 weeks after the deposition. It was for $350,000, the first of 3 installments. The total amount, with penalties and fees accounted for, came to $1,157,420. I didn't feel a rush of triumph when I saw the number. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of rightness, as if a crooked picture frame had finally been set straight. The house on Elm Street was no longer a battlefield. The silence that filled its rooms was no longer heavy with tension, but light with possibility. The grandfather clock in the hall, which had once sounded like a ticking bomb, now kept a steady, comforting rhythm, the heartbeat of a home at peace. I had the locks changed the day after the settlement was signed, a small, symbolic act that felt like the final word in a long, painful conversation. I spend my mornings on the sun porch now, sitting in my grandfather's rocking chair. It's finished. The oak, stripped of its old, cracked varnish and sealed with a dozen thin coats of oil, glows with a deep, honey-colored warmth. The new caned seat is strong and pliant, a perfect, intricate weave my own hands created. I rebuilt the cracked arm, the seam of the repair almost invisible, a faint scar that only I know is there. It's no longer just a piece of furniture. It's a monument to patience. It's proof that something broken can be made whole again, not by hiding the damage, but by carefully and honestly repairing it. Sometimes I sit with a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into my hands, and I watch the sun move across the overgrown lawn. The chair rocks with a slow, gentle creak, a sound that feels like a quiet conversation with the man who first sat in it all those years ago. From the porch, I can see my mother's rose garden. I've started to work on it, pulling weeds and pruning back the dead canes. It's slow, thorny work. As I dig in the cool, dark earth, I no longer feel the sting of her disappointment. I feel a strange, complicated sorrow. I understand now that her coldness was a kind of armor, a desperate attempt to protect me from the sun she couldn't stop enabling. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman trapped by her own choices, who saw only one way to make things right in the end. Her final act wasn't a gift of love, but a burden of justice, and she trusted me, the son she called a failure, to be strong enough to carry it. In a way, it was the greatest compliment she ever paid me. The house needs work. The leaky faucet upstairs is fixed. The stain on the ceiling has been repaired and repainted. The furnace has a new filter. Next week, I'm getting estimates to have the floors refinished. I'm not flipping it. I'm not selling it. I'm restoring it. It's what I do. I take what is old and neglected, what has been damaged by carelessness and time, and I find the solid core underneath. I strip away the layers of lies and neglect to reveal the honest truth of the grain. This house is my biggest project yet. It's more than wood and plaster. It's a life, a legacy. And for the first time since I was a boy dreaming of model airplanes, it finally feels like home. This house is quiet now, but it's a living quiet. It's the sound of sunlight moving across the newly polished floors and the whisper of wind through the old oak trees outside the window. For years I thought this place was a monument to my failure, but now I see it for what it is, a testament to survival. My brother believed that power was about taking, about controlling the narrative with loud threats and inflated numbers. He saw people as assets and love as leverage. He was wrong. True strength isn't what you take, it's what you build, what you patiently restore. He built his world on a foundation of lies, and in the end, it took just one small, leather-bound book of truths to bring it all crashing down. The lesson in all of this is simple, and it's one my grandfather tried to teach me long ago. Greed is a fire that consumes everything, especially the person who lights it. Dignity, on the other hand, is a quiet, solid thing. It's the core of you that remains when everything else has been stripped away, the honest grain beneath the chipped varnish. I'm not just living in these rooms. I'm bringing them back to life, piece by piece. It's a slow process, but it's honest work. And that's a foundation that will last a lifetime. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life.